The fire never really left her. Even now, years later, Lani Moana could close her eyes on any ordinary afternoon and feel it. The heat pressing against her skin like a living thing. The way the smoke had tasted metallic and thick at the back of her throat. The sound of a child screaming somewhere inside the orange wall of flames while her legs carried her forward instead of back. People called that bravery afterward. They used that word carefully, delicately, the way you place a flower on top of something you want to bury. What they didn't say, what nobody said, was that she had run into that fire because standing outside of it, watching, feeling utterly helpless, had been an unbearable kind of pain. She hadn't been brave. She had simply chosen one agony over another. She survived. Some others didn't. And the world, being the world, needed someone to carry that weight. She had arrived in Seoul on a Tuesday in November, stepping off a bus with a single weathered bag and a name written on a folded piece of paper. The name of an employment agency that placed domestic workers in the homes of Korea's wealthiest families. She didn't speak much Korean beyond what she taught herself from borrowed books and late-night audio recordings. She was 30 years old, Samoan by blood, quiet by nature, and she had learned long ago that the less space she occupied, the fewer questions people asked. Questions always led back to the same place. Back to the fire. Back to the village. Back to the faces she saw when she slept. The Kong mansion was not what she expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected. It sat behind iron gates at the edge of a private hill in northern Seoul, surrounded by manicured gardens that looked like they had never once been touched by wind. Everything about it was deliberate, controlled, the kind of house that didn't breathe so much as it held its breath permanently. A senior servant named Mrs. Park met her at the gate with a clipboard and a practiced smile that stopped precisely at her eyes. "You will clean the east wing," Mrs. Park said, walking briskly ahead. "You will not enter the master's private study. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not look directly at the master of the house." Lani had nodded, carrying her bag, watching the gravel beneath her feet. "He is." Mrs. Park paused at the entrance, seeming to search for the word carefully. "Particular. About his privacy." Lani would understand why 2 days later when she finally saw him. Kang Junwoo moved through his own house like a man who expected the walls to flinch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed always in dark colors that seemed to absorb the light around him rather than reflect it. His face, even in profile, carried the architecture of someone who had once been considered devastatingly handsome. The strong jaw, the sharp lines, the kind of bone structure that made painters want to work. But across the left side of his face, running from just below his eye down across his cheekbone and jaw, was a scar. Deep, permanent, the kind of scar that didn't fade with time so much as it settled in, became part of the geography of a person. Every servant looked away when he passed. It wasn't the scar that made them do it. Lani would realize this gradually. It was the silence he carried, the heavy, airless silence of a man who had decided, somewhere along the way, that connection was simply another word for future loss. Lani learned the rhythm of the house quickly. She was good at becoming invisible, at anticipating needs, at being present without demanding to be seen. She washed dishes before dawn, polished floors in the early afternoon, brought evening tea to the terrace where Junwoo sometimes sat alone, watching the city lights spread out beneath the hill like scattered embers. She always set the tray down without a word and turned to leave. Then, on her 6th day, a glass slipped. It was such a small thing. A simple glass, wet from the counter, sliding from her fingers in the narrow hallway outside the kitchen. It hit the marble floor with a sound like a sharp intake of breath, sudden and startling in the perpetual quiet of the mansion. Lani crouched immediately to gather the pieces, her heart beating fast, waiting for the reprimand she had been conditioned to expect. When she looked up, Junwoo was standing at the end of the hallway. Every other servant in the vicinity had already dropped their gaze to the floor, shoulders curved inward, making themselves small. Lani looked up because she was still gathering glass, because her hands were occupied, because she hadn't yet been fully trained out of the instinct to meet someone's eyes. Their gazes connected. She expected him to look away, everyone else did, from him. Or she expected the cold dismissal, the flick of irritation, the inevitable consequence. What she did not expect was for him to simply stand there, very still, with an expression she couldn't quite name passing across his face like weather moving over water. Something between surprise and something much older than surprise. Something that looked almost like recognition. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before she looked back down at the glass in her hands. When she stood, he was gone. She didn't think about it again until that night. She was bringing the evening tea to the terrace, routine unremarkable, when she found him already standing at the railing, a glass of something amber in his hand, staring at the city in the particular way of people who are not actually seeing what they're looking at. She set the tray on the small iron table and was turning to go when his voice stopped her. Low, unhurried. The kind of voice that had clearly spent years being listened to and had forgotten what it was like to need volume. You didn't look away. She turned. He hadn't moved from the railing. Earlier, he said. In the hallway. Lonnie considered him. In the dark, with only the ambient glow of the city rising from below, the scar on his face was less visible, and she could see something else instead. The exhaustion underneath the coldness. The specific weariness of someone who has been managing pain for so long it has become indistinguishable from personality. I was looking for glass pieces, she said simply. I didn't want to cut myself. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. An acknowledgement, maybe. Most people find somewhere else to look, he said. I've noticed, Lonnie said. And then, because she had never been very good at leaving things neatly packaged. It doesn't seem like it helps them. Or you. The silence that followed was long enough that she genuinely thought she had crossed a line she wouldn't recover from. She braced internally for dismissal. Instead, he turned slightly toward her. Why don't you avoid my face? She thought about lying. Something polite and harmless. But she was so tired of the small careful lies that living invisibly required. Because scars don't scare me, she said. Silence does. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the kind of looking that isn't about seeing what someone looks like but about trying to understand what they're made of. Go, he said eventually. His voice was not unkind. She went. But walking back through the dark corridor toward the servants' quarters, Lonnie felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not happiness, that was too large a word for what it was. It was smaller, quieter. It felt like being noticed without being diminished. Like the particular relief of existing in someone's perception without bracing for what comes next. She told herself it meant nothing. She was wrong. What she didn't see, as she disappeared into the interior of the house, was that Junwoo remained at the railing for a long time after she left, that he set his glass down, that he stood in the cold air with his hand pressed briefly against the scar on his face. A gesture she would eventually learn he made only when something had reached him past the walls he'd spent 2 years constructing, and stared out at the city with an expression that was entirely unguarded. That he stayed there for an hour, and that, for the first time since the accident, the silence didn't feel like punishment. Inside the mansion, on the 2nd floor, behind a window half lit by the glow of a filming light, Yoon Ha-rin stood with her phone lowered and her eyes fixed on the terrace below. She was 32 years old, beautiful with the precise and purposeful beauty of someone who had cultivated it as a survival strategy. And she had spent 18 months positioning herself as the woman at Junwoo's side. Not wife, he had never offered that. Not girlfriend, exactly, he had never offered that either. But she was present, constant, woven into the public fabric of his life in ways that felt, from the outside, like belonging. She had noticed the hallway moment hours ago. She had also noticed the terrace conversation just now. Ha-rin was many things. She was not unobservant. She lowered the curtain slowly, her perfectly manicured fingers pressing the fabric flat. A quiet woman from an island nobody here had ever thought about, who broke a glass and didn't look away, and Junwoo had spoken to her. Not the required brief exchange. Not the cold dismissal. He had spoken to her the way he used to speak, before the accident, before the scar, before he'd sealed himself behind walls so thick that Ha-rin herself had spent over a year pressing against them and making no impression. She picked up her phone and opened her camera. She didn't record anything. Not yet. She simply held it, looking at her own reflection in the dark screen, while somewhere below her, a man who hadn't really been present. 2 years stood in the cold air and breathed like someone remembering how. In the weeks that followed, nothing happened, and everything happened. This is the strange arithmetic of feelings that neither person is ready to name. The math of almost, of proximity becoming its own kind of language. Junwoo did not seek Lonnie out. He was far too controlled for that, too practiced in the discipline of wanting nothing. But he became aware of her in the way a room becomes aware of light entering it. Not through decision but through simple, undeniable fact. He noticed when she was present in a corridor before he turned into it. He noticed the specific quality of quiet that followed her, different from the held-breath quiet of the other servants. Hers was easy, undemanding, the quiet of someone comfortable in their own skin despite everything the world had done to make that difficult. He noticed that she hummed while she worked. Not loudly, just barely under her breath. Something low and melodic that he couldn't identify, and found himself, on more than one occasion, pausing near a doorway to listen to without announcing himself. He told himself this was simply the idle curiosity of a man with too much solitary time. He was also wrong. Lonnie, for her part, understood what was happening with the particular clarity of someone who had learned to read environments for signs of danger. She had spent enough of her life navigating spaces where the atmosphere could shift without warning. She had become, by necessity, finely tuned to the temperature of rooms, to the subtle architecture of other people's attention. She felt his awareness of her the way you feel a change in air pressure before rain. Not threatening, not demanding, just present and growing. She didn't encourage it. She also didn't run from it, which, for her, was the more significant choice. They developed rituals without discussing them. Evening tea on the terrace had become, quietly, a regular exchange. He would ask something brief and she would answer honestly, which was apparently such a radical occurrence in his life that he kept returning to it. He asked her once about Samoa, about what it looked like, and she described the way the ocean sat against the land. Not the postcard version but the real one, the salt and the wind and the way a storm could make the entire sky turn a color she still couldn't name accurately in any language. He listened with the still attention of a man receiving something he hasn't been given in a long time. She asked him once about before the accident. Most people didn't ask. Most people treated the scar as a wall they weren't allowed to acknowledge. She asked the way she asked most things, directly, without cruelty, the way you might ask about a storm that had clearly passed through and left marks on the landscape. He was quiet for a long moment. "I was different," he said finally. "Easier to be around, maybe. Or maybe just easier to be. And now," he looked at the city. "Now I'm honest," he said. "About what matters." She considered this. "That sounds like the accident gave you something. It took more than it gave." "Most things do," she said. "That doesn't mean the giving wasn't real." He looked at her then with that expression she was starting to recognize. The one that crossed his face when something reached past his defenses and he wasn't entirely sure what to do about it. Part surprise, part something softer and more vulnerable than he intended to show. Harin watched all of this with the focused attention of a woman constructing a case. She was not, at her core, a malicious person. This is important to understand, not because it excuses what she did, but because malice born from love is different in its texture from the cold kind, and it mattered to the shape of everything that followed. She had loved Junwoo with the complicated, consuming love of someone who had decided that another person's existence was the organizing principle of their own. She had bent her life around her public image, her schedule, her sense of self, and after the accident she had stayed when others left, which she counted as proof of something which she expected to be counted as proof. He had never once looked at her the way he looked at Lonnie, not even before the accident. This was the thing that broke something loose in her. She began quietly, planting seeds in the way that practiced people plant them, so naturally that nobody notices the gardening until the thing has already grown. A comment here to a staff member about the new maid being a little too comfortable with the master. A pointed reference there, in a phone call, to how unusual it was for a domestic worker from overseas to have so little documented history. She filmed herself in the mansion regularly. She had a lifestyle channel with a significant following, and in these videos she began including small, careful frames. Lonnie visible in the background, a little too close to Junwoo's space. Nothing explicit, just implication, which is the sharpest tool in this particular kit. Then a necklace disappeared. It was Harin's necklace, a gift from a fashion brand, documented on camera, valuable enough to make its absence worth reporting. She reported it to the head of household security with the measured distress of someone who hated to cause trouble but felt they had no choice. Security searched the servants' quarters as a matter of protocol. They found the necklace in Lonnie's belongings. Lonnie stood in the small interrogation room, which was really just a spare office repurposed for the occasion, and felt the familiar cold spreading through her chest. The cold of being seen as a thing rather than a person. Of watching the decision form in people's eyes before she had spoken a single word. The head of security was already composing the formal dismissal in his mind. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his fingers moved against the folder in front of him. Then the door opened and Junwoo walked in. He stood at the head of the table, looked at the necklace in the evidence bag, and then looked at Lonnie. She met his eyes directly. No flinching, no defensive posturing. Just the clear, level gaze of someone telling the truth with their whole body. "Did you take it?" he asked. "No." He studied her face for a long moment. Long enough that the security head shifted uncomfortably. Then Junwoo picked up the evidence bag and turned it over, examining the clasp. "This was placed," he said, simply, flatly, as a statement of observable fact. The room went very still. "Sir," the security head began. "The clasp is intact," Junwoo said. "This necklace wasn't found at the bottom of a bag. It was laid on top of folded clothing. Someone with access to this necklace decided where it would be discovered." He set the bag down. "Investigate accordingly." He left without looking at Harin, who had been standing in the doorway watching. Her face, in that moment, did something complicated. A crack running through the careful architecture of her expression before she rebuilt it, quickly, into something smooth and unreadable. She turned and walked away down the hall, and the sound of her heels against the marble was very precise and very controlled. That night, Lonnie stood on the rooftop of the servants' annex. It was cold. The kind of cold that Seoul does in late autumn that feels like the season itself pressing against your skin, demanding acknowledgement. She was looking at the lights of the city, thinking about home, thinking about fire, thinking about the specific weight of being accused by people who have already decided. She heard footsteps and turned. Junwoo stood a few feet away. "You shouldn't be up here," she said, not unkindly. "My house," he replied, moving to stand beside her at the railing. They were quiet for a while. The city hummed below them, indifferent and immense. "People decide who I am before I speak," she said eventually. Not with bitterness, she was too tired for bitterness. Just the plain, exhausted fact of it. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the city the way he always did, and then he said quietly, "I know that feeling," and something in those 4 words, the lack of performance in them, the total absence of the kind of sympathy that keeps its distance, made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. Because sympathy from a distance was what she'd received from well-meaning people her entire life. This was something else. This was recognition. 2 people standing at the same railing having survived separately the same kind of damage. "They'll keep trying," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You believe me," she said. It wasn't a question, but it held the slight tremor of someone who had been believed so rarely they couldn't help treating it as remarkable. He turned to look at her fully. "You're the only person in this house," he said, "who has never tried to manage me." She held his gaze. "I'm not trying to manage anything," she said. "I'm just trying to exist." He nodded slowly, something settling in his face, something that looked like the very beginning of peace. Below them, somewhere in the main house, Harin sat in front of her ring light with her phone recording and told her followers, in a voice like warm honey, that she had something important to share. It happened the way these things always happen. Fast enough to be deliberate, public enough to be devastating. Harin had 2.3 million followers, and she had spent 18 months turning those followers into people who trusted her voice the way you trust the voice of a friend. She was warm on camera in the way that takes years to perform convincingly. She shared enough of herself, or the carefully curated shape of herself, that people felt they knew her. This was her real power, and she had always understood it clearly. Not the beauty, not the proximity to wealth, but the intimacy. The feeling she gave people that they were inside the story with her. She went live on a Wednesday morning. She was seated in a beautifully lit room, wearing something simple, her expression carrying the specific weight of reluctant honesty. She said she hadn't wanted to share this. She said she'd tried to stay quiet. She said she was only speaking now because she was genuinely concerned, not for herself, but for people who might be deceived. Then she described Lani Moana, not by name at first, by description, a foreign maid, a woman with no traceable background, a woman who had appeared in this household under circumstances that deserved scrutiny. She spoke about the necklace. She expressed her concern about how close this woman had gotten to someone vulnerable, someone still recovering, someone who perhaps couldn't be expected to have his full judgment intact. She implied, without stating, that manipulation was at work, that innocence was being performed. And then, almost as an afterthought, the way the most precise wounds are always delivered, she mentioned a fire. She didn't have all the details, she said. She didn't want to make accusations. But there had been a fire years ago in a village somewhere in the Pacific. People had died. And this woman had been connected to it. The internet, being the internet, did the rest within hours. By afternoon, Lani's name was in headlines. By evening, there was a compilation video on 3 separate channels. Photographs, fragments of old news reports, the grainy images of a burned village, her face next to the smoke. The narrative assembled itself with the terrible efficiency of a story people wanted to believe. The scheming outsider, the naive billionaire, the fire that followed her like guilt. Lani found out from Mrs. Park, who came to her room with an expression that was not unkind but was also not particularly surprised. "You should know what's being said," Mrs. Park said, and held out her phone. Lani sat on the edge of her narrow bed and read. She was very still while she read. Her hands were completely steady, which was a thing her body did under certain kinds of pain. Went so still it looked like calm when it was actually the opposite, the way a held breath looks like rest. When she finished, she set the phone down on the bed beside her. She thought about the child screaming inside the fire. She thought about the investigation afterward, the investigators who had come from the mainland, with their clipboards and their assumptions, looking at her the same way the security head had looked at her here, in this country, an ocean away. The investigation had concluded what the evidence confirmed. An accidental fire, cause unknown, consistent with faulty electrical equipment in a building that had been reported to local authorities 3 times in the preceding year. No criminal negligence. No charge. But a verdict and a reputation are 2 entirely separate things, and the fire had followed her the way Harin had just described. Not because she carried guilt, but because the world needed to put weight somewhere, and she was the one who had run in and survived when others hadn't, which somehow, in the logic of human grief and blame, made her responsible. She was still sitting there when the door opened. Junwoo didn't knock. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then entered and stood a few feet from where she sat. She didn't look up immediately. "Is it true?" he asked. The question landed differently than she expected. Not with the weight of accusation, with the weight of someone who needed to know not to use it against her but to understand her. She could hear the difference. "Which part?" she said. "The fire." She was quiet. And then she told him. Not in pieces, not managed. Not the careful edited version she'd given to employers and authorities over the years. She told him about the village, about the building that had been failing for years while the landlord ignored the reports, about the night the fire started, about the sound she still woke up to sometimes, that lived behind her sternum, about running in, about who she found and who she couldn't reach, about standing outside afterward with her hands burned and her lungs full of smoke while the village watched her like a question they couldn't stop asking. When she finished, Junwoo was sitting in the chair across from her. "I didn't start it," she said. Her voice was level. "But I couldn't stop it." The silence held between them for a long moment. "That's not what she said," Junwoo said. Quiet, flat, final. The next morning he held a brief press conference. He stood in front of cameras with the contained composure of a man who had been managing crises his entire professional life and said, clearly, that Lani Moana was an employee of his household, that her work had been exemplary, and that every allegation circulating online was fabricated or misrepresented. He did not say it with visible warmth. He said it the way he said everything, with a precision that carried more weight than emotion would have. The press turned the temperature up the way they do when a powerful man defends a nobody, because a powerful man defending a nobody is a story with teeth. Harin escalated. She granted interviews now, specific and detailed, using fragments of the fire investigation in ways that were technically accurate and contextually weaponized. The case went to court with a speed that surprised even Junwoo's legal team. The courtroom was full on the first day. Lonnie sat at the plaintiff's table in a gray dress she had borrowed from Mrs. Park. Not because she lacked clothing, but because she had owned nothing that felt appropriate for this particular kind of visibility. She sat very straight. She looked at the room the way she looked at most things. Directly, without flinching, taking in information. Harin's lawyer was skillful. He built the narrative carefully, planting suggestion without overreaching, letting the courtroom fill in blanks with the biases people bring to rooms like this. He made much of the fire. He made much of Lonnie's lack of established roots. He spoke about the vulnerability of wealthy men in recovery, about the patterns of manipulation that exploited emotional states. Lonnie answered questions in a voice that was clear and unhurried. "You survived," the lawyer said, "while others did not." "Yes," she said. "Doesn't that seem fortunate and devastating?" she said. "Yes, both." The lawyer paused. He hadn't expected that. Junwoo sat in the gallery. He had been advised by his legal team to maintain visible neutrality. He sat with his hands folded, his face composed, and he watched Lonnie answer every question with an honesty so complete it was almost painful. Not the honesty of someone performing virtue, but the honesty of someone who had simply run out of energy for anything else. When his turn came, he stood and his lawyer introduced evidence that Junwoo had quietly, methodically assembled over the preceding weeks. The full investigative report from the fire, electrical inspection records, the landlord's ignored citations, security camera footage from the mansion showing the timeline of the necklace, including footage from a corridor camera that had been overlooked, which showed with quiet clarity Harin entering the servants' wing at an hour when the maids were all accounted for in the kitchen. The screen in the courtroom played the footage. The room went very still. Harin stood. "I did it for you," she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. The armor of her public self split open, and underneath it was something that looked recognizably like love, or the wreckage of it. "Everything I've done, everything. I did it for you, because I was there, because I stayed, because I should have been enough." Junwoo looked at her. "You destroyed an innocent person," he said, quietly, without cruelty, just the clear, undeflectable fact of it. Harin stood in the silence of a packed courtroom with her hands at her sides and her composure fully, irretrievably gone. Lonnie stood. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," she said, and she was speaking to the room now, to all of it. The cameras, the gallery, the years of being looked at and found guilty before anyone checked the evidence. "I'm asking for the truth. That's all I've ever asked for." The verdict came 40 minutes later. Defamation, confirmed. It rained on the day of the verdict. Not the dramatic storm rain of significant moments in films, but the quiet, persistent soul autumn rain that simply falls without announcement and soaks everything evenly, without preference. Lonnie stood outside the courthouse in it for a moment before anyone could reach her with an umbrella. She let it land on her face and her hair and the borrowed gray dress, and she thought about how much of her life she had spent trying to become small enough to stop drawing attention and how exhausted she was, how fundamentally and deeply exhausted by the work of that. Harin stood 20 feet away, surrounded by the reduced architecture of her public life. A single assistant, no camera, no following. The verdict had stripped away the performance, and what remained was a woman in her 30s in the rain, looking at nothing in particular with the expression of someone working out what comes next when the story you told yourself turns out to have had the wrong ending. She said something, half to herself, watching the street. "If I can't be loved," she said quietly, "I'll be remembered." Lonnie heard her. She stood with that sentence for a moment, feeling its particular sadness. The sadness of someone who had conflated those two things so completely they could no longer find the seam between them. She thought about saying something. She decided against it. Some grief needs the dignity of being left alone. Junwoo's car was waiting. His assistant held an umbrella at the door. He stood beside the car, not getting in, watching Lonnie in the rain until she turned and met his eyes across the wet pavement. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with an expression that was entirely open, entirely unmanaged. for once unguarded by the careful architecture of a man who had spent 2 years making sure nothing could reach him. She walked toward the car. The drive back to the mansion was quiet. Junwoo sat beside her with 3 inches of space between them that felt enormous and also like nothing at all. The city moved past the windows, rain-blurred, going about its business. He didn't ask how she was feeling. She was grateful for that. She had been asked how she was feeling so many times in the past weeks by people who needed a particular answer that the question had started to feel like another form of management. Instead he said, eventually, looking at the window, "Where will you go?" She looked at him. "I don't know yet," she said. Back at the mansion, she went to her room and began packing. Not frantically, with the quiet, methodical energy of someone who had packed and left enough times that the process was practiced. She folded her things neatly. She looked at the narrow room that had been her space for these months, at the single window that faced the garden, at the small shelf where she'd kept the 2 books she'd brought with her. She was closing her bag when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, and then a pause. She opened the door. Junwoo stood there. He looked at the bag. Something moved across his face. "You're leaving," he said. "I don't belong here," she said. It came out more quietly than she intended, and with more truth in it than she had planned to show. Not the polite version, not the managed exit line, but the real thing underneath. The fear that she never belonged anywhere for very long. That stability was something that happened to other people. That her presence in spaces always came with an expiration date written in fine print she couldn't read in time to prepare. He stepped into the doorway. Not into the room. Just enough that she couldn't simply brush past him. "Do you want to leave?" he said. "Or are you running?" The question hit something she wasn't ready for. She had run before. She knew the difference, in her body, between choosing to leave and fleeing, between the clean, deliberate exit and the panicked retreat dressed up as independence. She had done both. Enough times to recognize them. Standing here now, with her bag packed and her chest tight, she was honest enough with herself to admit she wasn't entirely sure which this was. "I don't know," she said. "How to stay somewhere without losing everything again." The words came out before she could shape them better, raw and plainly meant, and she watched his face receive them. He exhaled slowly. "I thought scars made people leave," he said. "I thought if I was different enough, damaged enough, difficult enough, eventually everyone would. So I made it easier for them. I made the distance first." He paused. "And then you walked into this house and broke a glass and looked at me like I was just a person, and I didn't know what to do with that." He stepped closer. "I'm not saving you," he said. "I want that to be clear. I don't think you need saving. I've watched you stand in a courtroom and answer for a fire that wasn't your fault and carry years of other people's grief, and I've never once seen you ask anyone to rescue you." He was close now. Close enough that she could see the scar clearly in the dim light of the corridor, could see it as what it was, part of the map of him, part of the evidence of a life that had continued past the point of breaking. "I'm choosing you," he said. "That's different. That's just me choosing. If you want to leave because leaving is what you want, then leave. But if you're running because you don't believe this is real, or because you're waiting for the part where it breaks." He stopped. "Don't run from something real. I've done enough running from real things for both of us." She stood in the space between her bag and the doorway and felt the thing she'd been managing very carefully for months. The feeling she'd been keeping at arm's length with both hands. Simply stepped past her defenses. "I don't know how to be loved," she said. "Without something breaking." He looked at her with no performance and no distance. "Then we break it. Together," he said. "And rebuild it." She looked at him for a long moment. At the scar, at the exhaustion she recognized because it matched her own, at the openness on his face that cost him something to show. She let go of the strap of her bag. He reached out and held her hand. Not dramatically, not with the practiced gesture of a man used to grand statements. Just his hand, finding hers, holding on with the quiet certainty of someone who has decided. She didn't pull away. They stood in the corridor of his enormous, silent house with the city somewhere below them and the rain still falling outside. And it wasn't the beginning of something easy. They both understood that without saying it, understood that 2 people carrying this much history don't simply walk into lightness. But it was the beginning of something true. Weeks later, on an evening that tasted like the first cold breath of winter becoming something else, They stood on the rooftop terrace where they had first really talked. The city spread out below them, lights multiplying in every direction, the kind of view that makes the scale of individual lives feel both small and specifically important. She was leaning against the railing. He stood beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had come to understand was not absence but consideration, the particular silence of a man taking something seriously. "We start again," he said. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. The city light fell across the scar on his face and she thought, not for the first time, that it was simply part of how he looked. Part of the person who had been cold and then less cold and then carefully, painfully honest. Part of the person who had believed her when it cost him something to do it. Part of the person who had chosen her not out of rescue but out of recognition. He lifted his coat from his shoulders and placed it over hers, and the gesture was so plain and so careful that something in her chest broke open in the best possible way, the way a window breaks open, letting in air. She leaned slightly toward him. He stayed. Below them, the city continued its relentless, indifferent, beautiful noise. Above them, the sky was doing something extraordinary with clouds and the remains of sunset. Neither of them mentioned it, but both of them felt it. The way certain moments offer themselves to you without demanding that you perform your feeling about them. The way something real simply asks to be present, in itself without explanation. She thought about fire. She thought about the long road from that burning village to this rooftop, the years of carrying things she hadn't chosen to carry, the particular loneliness of being visible only as a problem or a punchline or a cautionary tale. And she thought about a glass breaking in a hallway, about a man who could have looked away, and didn't. "Thank you," she said, quietly. He didn't ask what for. He already knew.
Hi guys, in this story we learn that people will try to define you by your worst moment, but your truth is not decided by their narrative. Liane is judged by a fire she didn't cause, just like John Woo is reduced by his car. Both are treated as symbols instead of human beings. The story shows that what saves them isn't revenge, status, or even love at first. It's being seen truthfully by someone who refuses to look away. Kindly like and subscribe. Thank you.